Hello and welcome to this very special video podcast from the Dylan Thomas Birthplace, number 5, Cundonkin Drive, here in the uplands of Swansea. You join me, Matthew Hughes, the curator of the Birthplace, well, in what was Dylan's tiny bedroom. It's a hugely important room for Dylan Thomas. Believe it or not, it's where nearly 2/3 of his work had its origins from. It feels very apt that we're in here today. We'll be speaking to Dr. David Sands, author of the new book, Dylan Thomas Made Genius. David comes from Chorley in the north of England. He is a writer, he's an animal behaviourist and psychologist, and also a musician. In the new book, he looks at whether Dylan may have had a condition known as synesthesia, and whether that condition actually influenced Dylan's creativity. We'll be conducting the interview over Skype. Unfortunately, David can't be here, but through the wonders of technology, we'll see what we get from the interview. So without further ado, here's David. So hi Dave, thank you very much for joining me on this very first podcast from the house.
Hi Matthew, it's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. I suppose first of all, Dave, I'll say congratulations on the release of this fantastic new book, Dylan Thomas Made Genius.
Thank you. It's been a while in the making, and it's just nice to have it in my hand and see it there where you are right now in Dylan's birthplace.
Yeah, it's very apt really, isn't it, to be in his bedroom with this book.
Perfect.
That's great. So I suppose, to start this off is the question, what is synesthesia?
Well, synesthesia is quite interesting, and it was only when I started to delve into Dylan that I even began to understand it. I was aware of it. In simple terms, it's a merging of two senses, of our 5 major senses. So we can smell what we hear, taste what we see. It's in the synapses in the brain. They come together, and for some reason or other they fuse. And the analysis is quite straightforward in the book. I could quote from it. It involves a pair of senses. Some people experience more than one type. Examples are the letter A is dark brown, the sound of a bell is red. And when I heard it, I just thought Dylan. Now,
yeah, absolutely.
In the early phases, I was more thinking about him being what we call high functioning or autistic. It's a wide spectrum, autism, and it covers a lot of individual little quirks. People tend to think of the extremes of people who are, so challenged they can't relate to the world and have difficulty existing normally. What people don't always think about is these people who are highly skilled, who have great memories, who can draw buildings from memory, who can count numbers to infinity, and these people are quite special. And my life with Dylan started when I was at school, when I won this book, this collected poems, for my English prize. And I'd already heard recordings. I had a wonderful English teacher who inspired us. He had a thundering voice himself, but when you play Dylan's pulpit thundering voice on top of that, death shall have no dominion, do not go gently into that good night. I was inspired from then. So it was only, I did a book in 1988 called The Best Blue, which was my own poetry that had been generally written right from schoolboy times till then, and my cloud photography. I'd been taking pictures of clouds for as long as I could photograph, right. And some of them had been used by the Met Office for television use, for weather and things. And over the years, as my love of poetry, writing myself, always acknowledging that Dylan was one of my biggest inspirations, I felt in recent years that I would like to do a similar book, but this one with a Dylan theme. So I planned in 2012 to come up to Larne and photograph the boathouse, look at all the scenery and scenic, try to get some magical photographs, and then put them together with poems that were inspired by Dylan. And then I thought I'd write a bit of an essay, and this essay grew. And from that first visit to Larne and several visits later, what was going to be a little essay in this photograph poetry book became a full focus onto Dylan, And whilst I was at the boathouse, a guy there called Toby said, "Have you been to Dylan's birthplace in Swansea?" I said, no, I've never been to Swansea in my life. He said, oh, it's worth it. Go there. And of course, later on, I arranged to come and stay the night.
And what a contrast to the boathouse as well.
It is, and I do sort of mention this in the book, that people would think the boathouse is as Dylan was when he lived there, or the shed was as Dylan was in those days. And to be truthful, the recreations, there are one or two artifacts. One I show in the book, which is the boat that Dylan brought back for Llewellyn from the States, and that was hidden away when I went there. And there's this wonderful book of lithographs done by Johann Heisig, based on Dylan's poetry. Wonderful book that I encountered there, but I know that it's a recreation. The only thing that is true to Dylan is that Taff Bay, that estuary, Sir John's Hill. You know, when you do the birthday walk, it's wonderful. But I wanted to come to Cumdonkin Park. This was the significant trigger for me, because by the time I was planning to stay at where you are right now,
Cumdonkin Drive,
yeah, absolutely, 5 Cumdonkin Drive, I'd already bought several biographies. I wasn't interested in the old days in this Dylan caricature and all these biographies. I was interested in his poetry more than anything else. And Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog, those short stories, which are fabulous. And but I started to build up this collection, and that it kind of snowballed. Do you know what I mean? But stood on that sloping drive, all of a sudden, stories of Dylan cycling down at a helter-skelter speed. You know, it brought it all alive to me. And I do recognise that even where you are now is a recreation, but it is still the house, and it's the house that he was born in, and that bedroom is his den, where those notebooks were written. And that's the most exciting thing for me, because he was a childhood genius, there's no doubt about that, but he was also peculiar in his behaviours, in his obsessions, in his fixations. And you know, I related to that more than anything else.
I think what we've got here in the bedroom as it is now is the fact that virtually everything in here, yes, it is a recreation, but we've gone to the lengths to go out and get bits and pieces and artifacts and memorabilia that he actually mentions in letters. Some of the books that he read, there are things that are mentioned in biographies, plays that he performed in at school. So we're trying to make it as authentic as we possibly can. So when people come here, as you did, you will get that true feeling that, you know, that Dylan could possibly just walk through this door now and try and kick me out.
Yeah, and I so agree with you, because the spirit of Dylan is definitely there. To know that next to the bathroom is that hot cupboard where the pipes talk to him. There were so many things, like his father's study. You could see it when you walk. In fact, that room, his father's study that leads out to the back garden, I spent more time in there than any other time. And I imagine Dylan as a boy pulling a book off the shelf. I don't know whether it was, you know, the poetry or Shakespeare or whatever, but I could imagine him having access to his father's library and sneaking back up into his den and absorbing it, you know.
Oh, well, absolutely absorbing it. Yeah. And we're talking about his study there, and Dylan having access to all this wonderful material. You know, the fact that DJ Thomas's father is teaching him Shakespeare at the age of 4, and then by the age of 7, Dylan's got it all stored up here, and he's reading huge extracts to his teacher, and just totally blowing this poor woman's mind, you know. But it's the attention to detail, and he is like a little sponge at that point.
Exactly, but in a special way, that he could do that. And, you know, I'm sure his father had aspirations for him, you know, that he would go to university and perhaps himself become an academic or a teacher, you know. And yet it's almost like they stood back and said, yeah, he's special. He's got this ability to memorize, you know, to even suggest that he's going to be a greater poet than Keats. That's to Florrie, his mother, who said, I'm never going to ask him again. But to see that in that boy, you know, and teenager, and recognize it and not make a fuss.
Yes, yeah.
I think they knew something was going on that was different with Dylan. And don't get me wrong, being surrounded by culture and intelligence probably helped him. You know, his father being a frustrated poet himself, but also being, you know, a classical teacher, you know, an English teacher. And I think that gave him that access to that library and to that culture. And it shows, you know, although I've been warned about his relationship with Dan Jones, there seems to be a lot of stimulus there about music, about creativity, you know, about you know, art and the other aspects of creativity, that he was very alive. You know, when I read some of his early critiques of things, you know, he had the brain of an adult.
Absolutely.
In ways, you know, and yet in other ways, when you read, say, from the Colin Edwards recordings of how childish he could be at the same time, and how he could lock himself away, how he could copy a poem out 100 times, those notebooks. You know,
he's very much, I suppose, like a Peter Pan type character, Dylan Thomas, as well, in that respect. And I think you're right when you're talking about Dan Jones and the word games that they would play, and the music, and the freedom that they both had there over at Dan's house in Warmley. You know, that was all going on with Dylan, and the way that they would finish each other's poems, and Dylan would try his hand at some music. And as I've said before, Dylan was very much a modern man, interested in many different forms of creativity, whether it be painting and surrealist art, or writing and acting too. So it's got all different facets, and they're all bouncing off one another. Bit like your terminology of the kaleidoscope effect with synesthesia.
Yeah, I think that's a term that I've used that's going to stick with me now. But it's just how I'm an imagist myself. I probably have synesthesia. I certainly have mild autism, certainly obsessive compulsive. If you saw what I did over the years, you know, writing textbooks, spending years photographing things minutely, you know, another reason why I understand him. But I could see that kaleidoscope moving, and you can see the sounds of the words, how special they were. Not just the words themselves, but the sounds of the words. And I say at the opening of the book, the way he played tricks with them. You know, he would reverse things. You know, that hot coals could be cold. You know, he would always reverse something, or he would take a biblical expression and twist it around. And his epigrams were very similar to Oscar Wilde. I mean, I made a mild, I thought, if I'm going to make this book, I'm going to make some wild ideas out there, you know, and I thought I'll compare him to the person they'd least compare him to. And I felt Oscar Wilde, you know, who came from a completely different background, more cultured, you know, was very extrovert, where I would suggest that Dylan was introvert but became an extrovert when he went on stage. They both went to America, they both made the name there, both ended up practically in poverty and died early. You know, I know there are complete differences in the two of them, statures and the like, but you know, when I think about what Dylan did in his short period of time, one of the most, for me, not just thinking about how his brain worked in this unique way and trying to write differently about Dylan than the other biographers. You know, my thing was, at the end, I was thinking, God, how did he live to be 39? In Dylan years, I reckon that was 99, you know, because he lived life to the full. He didn't care for possessions. He wasn't material. In a way, I also find it quite interesting. In the early days, he wasn't interested in the image of himself.
That's right, yeah, and you can imagine, you know, the flamboyant clothes that he would wear, and you're right in the heart of the Depression.
Yeah.
Especially here in Swansea, this big industrial town. You can imagine the looks that he would have been given, but he just didn't care. That's what he imagined a poet should look like, and to hell with everybody else. That's what he was going to do.
And this is true. I mean, you know, there were so many sides to him. Caitlin, his wife, said there's no one Dylan, and I think everybody recognised that. But why wasn't there one Dylan? And I think this is the way his brain was working and how he developed. And he just got into that area that he was good at. And he could have been, I mean, Richard Burton said he could have been a great actor. You know, it was acknowledged. I found it interesting that Charlie Chaplin would accept his poor behaviour because he knew that there was something special about him. And how many people, when you look at the biographies, said there was something special about him? You know, Richard Hughes said when he was at the castle there at Larne that he could take the wine because he was such a great guy to have around. You know, and we'd all be like that. There's some good parties when there's characters, and these days there's not enough characters. I'm not as interested in the caricatures of Dylan Thomas. You know, I think it's very easy to say, you know, he was a drunkard, that he was a womanizer. And yet, you know, I went to America, I left my family behind. A millionaire offered me everything I ever wanted, and it was a lie. But I got out there and I missed my family, and I looked for surrogate mothers and surrogate wives. I knew exactly how he would feel, but I also knew, coming from a little Lancashire village, how incredible New York City was. You know, imagine post-war Dylan going into America, welcomed by everybody, being applauded for great performances, you know, being feted by everybody, and yet going from this little village of Larne or from the town Swansea, you know, post-war austerity to this. I mean, America in that time was quite prosperous, you know.
How are you supposed to deal with it?
Yeah,
It's a completely different world. It really is.
yeah,
Just going back now to the origins of the book, and we've talked
yeah,
a little bit about the Colin Edwards series of interviews where you really get that wonderful sort of almost insider view of Dylan and his characters and his mannerisms. Was there, apart from those, was there a particular piece of work that you looked at first of all and thought, oh, that's showing signs of synesthesia or being a bit special?
Well, this is the problem I've got. The synesthesia came towards the end. I thought if he's sort of the way he worked, the way he operated, the way he played around with the words in an obsessive way, but liked the sounds of the words, and almost the meanings became secondary. The words were important. You can see in his scribbles and his notes and his drawings how he's trying to put it together, and it's hard for me to say. I mean, my personal favourite poem of all time is "And Death Shall Have No Dominion," and I can see the pictures in it. You know, when they say the heads of characters come out like daisies, you know, I can see the pattern of the person, the face in the daisies. Now, I don't know whether that makes me as strange as Dylan was, but I can't particularly say one particular piece of work, although I did look at the early poems. I did look at 18 poems and 25 and Deaths and Entrances, and I looked for where he had used terms like the sound of light, you know, where you've got two senses being mixed in. And I found quite a few, a sequence of those that I detail at the beginning. I now feel I should have added more of those and done more analysis, but I was trying to keep it. I wanted the book to be as good for someone just reading it who had a general interest than someone who was particularly sort of au fait with psychological terms and behavioural terms, psychiatric terms. You know, I'm familiar with it. I've been studying OCD and fixations and obsessions and compulsions and stress-related behaviours for 30 years. And I use it in my work as an animal behaviourist. You know, my doctorate is in ethology, which is animal psychology, but I've studied psychology, you know, for a lot longer than that. And but I wanted to look at Dylan from a different position, but I didn't want it then to overpower people. And I still think now there could be points in it that might put somebody off, and I didn't want them to be put off. I tried to put notes at the back of the book so that if somebody wanted a bit more detail, they could look at it. And I've been heartened recently that people who've read it in sequence have said they understand it. You know, when, in the conversations I had with George Tremlett, you know, who's well known as a Dylan-related author and co-authored the book with Caitlin Thomas of her biography, he was interested in the fact that I compared my parts of my life story with Dylan. And I want to make it clear, I'm not saying I'm a genius like Dylan, but it meant that I had empathy with him. I had the same conditions as him. I had stomach ulcer when I was in the States. I've had gout in recent years, which I've fought successfully by changing my diet. And now Dylan, when he was in America, hadn't been given so many lobster lunches. He may have not had it badly. And if he'd been dealt with better by doctors, that might have been better. But I think it's very easy to blame things. And I'm sorry if I digress like this. But if when I was first unfolding it, I was looking for clues on every major biography, but I found more clues in the Colin Edwards interviews than anywhere else, because they were related to friends and family who spoke about him, who discounted some myths. You know, you can see them there. I quote them, oh, he didn't drink a lot. He drank socially. You know, he was quite happy to drink a glass of milk or, and it's interesting how a caricature builds up and in the end people see a person for the top,
Yeah.
of what's in the media, what's in the public eye, and don't see the other part of the iceberg that's beneath it, And I know you asked me the question, what first work? The early poems gave me an idea, but not necessarily an idea about synesthesia. I want to say that developed. And in a way, I subtitled the book wrongly to say how synesthesia affected his behaviour and creativity. I should have just wrapped it all up in that made genius. I just had this idea of artistic, autistic,
Right.
and I didn't want that to sound like he had something wrong with him. I wanted it to sound like he had something special in him that people recognised, and particularly the childishness. I have a real childish enthusiasm. I've had all my life, and it will never change. If you know me
Good.
for 20 years, no, honestly, it's the way I am. If I'm passionate about something, I'm honest and I'm upfront and straight, And I see that passion in Dylan Thomas. I can see the special side in him. I can see the caring side that people don't always see in some of the interviews about him nursing a little girl's foot when she'd got an injury. About him being kind to older people. About him relating to working class people.
Absolutely, yeah. This is something with Dylan actually, is that when you look at the type of people that Dylan liked to mix with best, they were the ordinary working class. He'd be talking to homeless and more down and out type people as well, and also a lot of his peer group. Some were substantially older than him. People like Bertrick, 15 years older.
Yeah.
Vernon Watkins, 8 years older. But they can see in him and they champion him and they realise that what they've got, they always refer to Dylan as their discovery. They've discovered a genius, and they realise that. And Dylan feels more comfortable around these type of people, these older people that seem to understand him more.
Yeah, I agree with that. I got the vibe for that. That maybe some of the more snooty academics actually not scared him, but didn't interest him. He didn't want to get into a competition with them, and I think he his peers around him recognised what he had. So some were critical of him. It depends who's looking at him. Others. I think the fact that people can interpret his poems, like today some people interpret good lyrics of a song to suit their life, I think some of his work, particularly, I got very, very interested in how he's a nature boy, how that's, you talked about him being a sponge, he absorbed all that nature as well, and his obsession with herons and his obsession with birds, his obsession with the Gothic, I found quite interesting. He was forever scaring himself like a child and loved it in one way, and in another, I'm not sure. I find it interesting that he had these two sides to him, and many introverts and extroverts. The extrovert part is when they're performing. The introvert, the real person, is when they're outside of that performance. It's almost like they can put something else forward.
Yeah.
I've lectured to students, I've done television filming, and I've been in front of big audiences, and initially you are nervous, but then you get conditioned to it and it gets easier and easier. I think Dylan was a bit like that, and if different opportunities had come at different times, I think he could have gone on to do other things. And certainly in this era, if we think about him, he could have been a great celebrity. He could have been a Stephen Fry, if you know what I mean. Perhaps not as intellectual in some ways, but in other ways, he could have been a great performer who could have, I don't know, done so many different things.
I think, of course, when you talk about that and that the one that got away, the opera with Stravinsky, of course, that he was going to go out. You can imagine this blending of sound and his imagery and his words and everything, and what that may have turned out like as well.
Absolutely, and Stravinsky actually made a room available for Dylan, didn't he?
That's right, yeah, whole wing.
When I read that, and Stravinsky wrote a piece after Dylan's death, and in fact, that coming together of a lot of people, there was a big mourning for Dylan after he'd gone, and You know, one of the things that a few people touch on is that it was almost as though Dylan was the first rock star. That you have to die young, you have to die as a burning star. Do you know what I mean? As a bright star, you know, when you think of people talking about him in great terms, fellow poets, and you know, Richard Burton, as we've said, and top poets from that who've always said, you know, that he reached the peaks very, very early. I also like some of the comments that he couldn't have done what he did if he'd have been, you know, this caricature of just a drunkard. You know, I can't see that myself now. You know, I think it's very easy to fall into things that make you feel better in life. You know, we can all get addicted to that, but I think at the end of the day, it was a recipe for this train crash. But after it, I think his work just opened up to so many people, ordinary people as well as academics, you know. And the irony is, in recent years, people like John Goodby have kind of said he's not being built up in the same way as T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, you know what I mean? And yet, I think his work can still be mined, as Under Milk Wood is being remade, and other aspects of his work are coming forward. When, you know, what surprised me, I knew a little bit that he did script writing during the war for some of the propaganda films, but it's only when you start to dig into his work you realise that he was writing scripts for film, and he was writing sort of playlets and novelettes and so many other things, you know. It's almost like, what could he have done? But, you know, I focus not on that end. I've tried to focus on the beginning. If you look, there's only one chapter on that end for me. The important parts are, I can see him, in modern terms, I think he's like the child who's on the PlayStation all the time, obsessive, you know, switching off from the world, just focused on one thing, you know. I can see him being the Gothic, you know. When I looked at the analysis of all the words he used, you know, a lot of them are dark and bloody and demons and angels. And
well, and especially those early poems, you know, the notebook poems. My gosh, yeah, there's a lot of that you find in there. Now, just going on a little bit as well with the book. Now, of course, it's a very different type of book. It's not your average biography or study of his works. And you said there's a lot of yourself in the book as well. Now, of course, this is a very different book. Are you worried at all by any criticism that you'll get? Or I know that you said it's been pretty positive so far.
When I'm waiting for it in that northern style, I feel like I'm riding for a fall. You know, it's like I've given birth to something, an idea, and now I'm worried, will people like it? Will they like this baby, this idea? But maybe because I've not tried to follow the path of other people and done something different. I mean, so far, yeah, the people, a couple of enthusiasts, real Dylan files, if that's what the name is, they've read it and enjoyed it. And you know, I've not pushed for anybody to sort of give me praise. I want it to slowly creep out there and for people to find things in it that are good. I'd like to say that I stand on the shoulders of the biographers and people like Colin Edwards, who, if he hadn't have taken that time and travelled around and done all those recordings, I think I'd know a lot less about him, because you know, that was one of the things. I think I was expecting criticism from people who would say, how do you know? How could you come up with this theory? And I want to say to them that I'm very instinctive, and I had a feel that there was something that everybody knew there was something different about Dylan. What I'm trying to get at is, what was that difference? What made him so disinterested in general academia, but so focused on that one thing? And I feel that it was because it was an outlet for the way his brain worked. And for me, the best writers, the best musicians, the best painters, the best creatives they're not satisfied in just looking at the sunset. They've got to write about it, they've got to paint it, they've got to do a theme tune to it. And it's because they want to express themselves. The more secure someone is, I don't think they need to. So these people are neurotic, they're extroverts, they're introverts, you know, and without them, we'd have a world with a lot less characters. And that's I'm ready for somebody to say, "How do you know that?" Or "I'm not sure you've gone down the right road," you know. But I'm also, I'll take those in the same way that I will take the praise and say, "Well, I'm just glad that I've been able to produce it." You know, I could have sat there and said, you know, I'm going to do this book and never do it. But in my life, I've always wanted to do the things that that I feel passionate about, and this Dylan Thomas made genius. That's my contribution. And to be honest, it's a way of saying thanks to Dylan Thomas, and I genuinely mean that. I loved his poetry as a boy, and my very first poem published in the school magazine was called "Birds of Fire, Birds of Sky," and it was only doing the research now, when I was reading Prologue, the handwritten one in the new collection of poems, that I realised where I'd got that term from. And when I look at that poem now, as written by me as a 15-year-old, you know, I could see how much he inspired me.
Oh, that's wonderful. So just moving towards the end of the interview, where can people get a hold of the book at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it's available on Amazon. I mean, people could contact me directly and get it directly from me. I don't mind. But the hardback at the moment, which is a limited edition, numbered 1 to 100, that's available via Amazon to me. The paperback, which should be out next month, I've just seen that the cover's been printed, and that will be again available on Amazon and possibly available in places like your Birthplace there, or the Boathouse or whatever. You know, I'm hoping that people will take it for those that want to see the other side of Dylan.
And is there plans for it to go high tech? Will it be on Kindle? Will it be on Amazon and things like that?
Yeah, I've toyed with that as well, because Kindle Fire, you can put pictures in, and I've a lot of photographs that didn't get in the book, which frustrates me totally. I now want to see this big, you know, tabletop book with lots of big spreads on. Some of the beautiful. I mean, I put in a few photographs by Simon West, who we've become friends. He's a photographer. You might have seen his work, and his photographs are brilliant. And I put some of his in at the expense of mine, you know, simply because I wanted to make the book as good as possible. Now on Kindle Fire, you can mix the two, but I don't think it would have the same feel. I'm a book man.
And me too. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, when I was buying all these books, and I'm telling you, I got carried away. I've got first editions of 18 poems and 25 and the like, and I did get carried away, I have to say. But so for me, I want it in my hand. And you know, there is a big difference. I've got the poems in the collected poems, haven't I? But when you see Death and Entrances as a little book this big,
absolutely,
and you open it up, and when you open 18 poems up, and you realise he didn't want a picture of himself in it.
That's right.
He says in it, at the author's instruction, there's no photograph, and of course all books. I mean that. Actually, that could turn us around in a good circle, because I always remember the picture on the front of my copy of collected poems that I got, you know, for my school prize, which has been pinched by my eldest son who lives in Liverpool, because he knew I had a replacement in the other edition. But at least it's in the family, you know. But that picture of him, you know, in New York, where they're rehearsing Under Milk Wood.
Yeah.
And he sort of pointed, he's got a cigarette, has he, or whatever, you know.
It's the iconic image, isn't it?
That was a rebel, because, you know, if you looked at authors' pictures before that, they were always sat behind a desk in a very studious manner, weren't they? And that picture just said everything about. I think he was my hero right from the start. But sorry, I digressed again, Matthew.
That's a great indication of just how different was, I think, and I think that's a great place to finish up on, Dave. So thank you very much once again for joining me on the first podcast from the house. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Lovely, and I've really enjoyed it. And I could talk to you for another hour. So
well, we'll have you back again.
Good. Well, I'll come back to 5 Cumdonkin Park Drive, because I love it there. So, and we can share a beer and talk more about Dylan. Wow. But yeah, bottom line is, we need the book in our hands, don't we? So
absolutely.
At the moment it's that. But if Hannah Ellis tells me that she loves it, then maybe I can get a publisher who will do the bigger version, and we can take it on to the next level. All right.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Dave.
Yeah. Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
So there we have it. A fascinating interview there with Dr. David Sands, author of the new book, Dylan Thomas Made Genius. Go out there, get yourself a copy of the book and come to your own conclusions. This has been the first in a new series of podcasts known as Discovered at Dylan's. Discovered at Dylan's is a new arts initiative programme being run here from the Dylan Thomas Birthplace, and it gives established and up-and-coming creatives the opportunity to come to the house, do an interview over Skype, come in and do a live web stream, and publicise themselves and their work. It's vitally important that your work gets out there. If you'd like more details, please drop me an email at matt@dylanthomasbirthplace.com. Remember to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Dylan Thomas Birthplace. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @Dylan Thomas Home. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you next time.